So I've done a little bit of work last week. We talked about the historical Jesus, and here's the thing. One of my arguments is that the historical Jesus is a fiction. That is, the scientific attempt to discover the real Jesus using so-called critical tools results in a fiction every time. I believe it's Michael Bird. Yeah, it's Michael Bird in his book, The Gospel of Our Lord, says there's no such thing as the uninterpreted Jesus. Jesus is that which causes us to reinterpret everything. That's, in other words, Jesus' character is, he in himself is a hermeneutic. He's a parable. He's a riddle. His very existence challenges everything, not simply about what we think, but how we think. And I think that's what Bird is suggesting when he says there's no such thing as an uninterpreted Jesus. And last week I made the case, even talking about the lives of Jesus, the 19th century first quest, the liberal quest, and moving into the third quest, talking about the third questers, the Jesus Seminar folks and others, that we all make Jesus to a degree in our own image. And I admitted even I did that. When I go back and look at the Jesus-driven life, I can see that I'm emphasizing things that in Jesus that are part and parcel of my story, how I interpret my own journey. And so those things are somehow important. So given that, what we want to recognize is, and this is next week's talk, by the way, this is the bridge between this first talk on the historical Jesus and the next week, is we're going to come to this place where we will recognize the extraordinary value of Jesus research and Second Temple research, and all of that means as we seek to discover the impact of Jesus on the early Christians and then why they recorded his story. So that's going to be next week. Today, what I want to do is talk about that impact, and also to note that the study of the impact of Jesus is going to be different than the quest for the historical Jesus. But the study of the impact of Jesus is far more important and yields more, shall we say, historical data than the so-called quests for the historical Jesus. And this category of the studying the impact of Jesus comes from Jimmy Dunn, or James Dunn, as most of you know, James D.G. Dunn, the British scholar. Now, Jimmy Dunn has a big, fat 900-page book that I don't have with me on my trip here called Jesus Remembered. And in that book, what he's doing is he's looking at the development of the narrative tradition, the oral tradition, from the crucifixion to the written Gospels. Now think about this. If Jesus dies in April of 33, and the temple is destroyed in and around 70 CE, and Mark's gospel is the first written gospel, if we work with that Markan hypothesis, that's in 70 CE, if we follow people like Joel Marcus, we're looking at a gap of almost 40 years where stories about Jesus are going to be circulated, where communities gather to tell stories and share teachings of what Jesus did during his lifetime. The question that has plagued this discussion of oral tradition has primarily to do with the early form critics, Rudolf Bultmann, Martin Debelius, K.L. Schmidt, and their use of this is now turn of the 20th century folkloric research, how folklore develops. And Bultmann and Debelius and others will eventually be able to say, okay, so all of this stuff in the Gospels from a form critical perspective, we can trace back to the early church here and here and here and here. And there's very little authentic historical Jesus stuff in the Gospels. And almost all of it, as I pointed out last week, is related to this criterion of dissimilarity. That is, if there's a saying of Jesus that cannot be found a parallel in the Hebrew scriptures, Second Temple Judaism, or the early church, then chances are that thing which is completely out of step is Jesus. And part of the problem there is that we end up turning Jesus into an anti-Jew. That is, we're essentially saying Jesus could have nothing in common with his tradition, and he didn't borrow from anywhere or anything or change anything. And I frankly find that to be patently absurd, a method when it's the only one that's used. And sadly, that's what ends up being used by Bob Funk of the Jesus Seminar. And frankly, I think it's one of the reasons that the entire third quest has to be deemed a failure, because it's fundamentally no different than the first quest. So I don't know what the next quest of Jesus is going to look like, but I suspect that it's going to have to leave the academy and come back into the church. That is, the quest for what Luke Timothy Johnson in his book calls the real Jesus has to take place within the circle of believers, because from the very beginning, from the resurrection forward, the message of Jesus, his story, is never separated from the body of those he calls his ecclesia, his people, his church, his children, the Father's children. That is, it is the memory of Jesus that is preserved in the tradition, and it is the tradition which the church remembers. So when Paul says, for example, in 1 Corinthians 11 and in 1 Corinthians 15, with regard to the Eucharist as well as the content of the gospel, he says, that which I received, I passed on to you. And this is rabbinic terminology. That is, a rabbinic pupil would receive a teaching from a master, they would memorize it, and then they would pass on what they memorized. Now, scholars are fond of going, oh yeah, so let's just play like the telephone game, and one early Christian said this to another, and then they said it to another who passed it on to another, and by the time it got to Steph there in England, it was, and Jesus said, drink all the water you want, but beer is better, you know? I mean, that's how scholars imagine this, and that's simply not the case. And there's a number of reasons why this is not the case. And I want to examine some of those reasons within the early church to be able to make an argument that, in fact, while we may not have a lot of the exact words of Jesus in the Gospels, that we don't, first of all, we don't need those, because the risen Lord, who is himself guiding this traditioning process that we've talked about previously when we did our thing on right traditioning back in July, the risen Lord who's guiding this traditioning process by the Spirit is working with the communities of faith all around the ancient world who are populated with eyewitnesses. Now, there's, let me shift this so that we can see it. There is this book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham. So some of you are going to want to note this book. One of the excellent things about Bauckham's work is that if you stop and think, just before I get to why Bauckham's book's really good, stop and think about this. At Pentecost, and in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul recognizes this event. He says, Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at the same time. 500. So there are 500 eyewitnesses to the risen Jesus. One would assume that the vast majority of those eyewitnesses would have known Jesus one way or another during his lifetime. So you have 500 witnesses. By the time the church gets to 70 CE, 40 years later, the estimates are that it has a population of 20,000. So it's going to take 40 years to go from 500 to 20,000. 40 years, okay? During that 40-year span, if you take the number of eyewitnesses and you start dividing it into the growing population of Christendom, for example, let's say by the time of Saul, when Saul gets converted in October of 34, let's say perhaps the church had 2,000 total, and it had 500 eyewitnesses. That's a 1-to-4 ratio. Let's say by the year 41, it's reached, say, 5,000. Okay, you have a 1-to-10 ratio in terms of eyewitness to number of people that are part of the movement. So, for example, and I can use two examples here. One is the circle around Bonhoeffer. Back in the 80s, there were still 30 or 40 eyewitnesses to Bonhoeffer's life. And then there were the next generation like me that could talk to those eyewitnesses. Okay, we couldn't talk to Bonhoeffer, he's dead, but we could talk to the eyewitnesses who knew him and ask all of our questions and get the various answers we received in this and that and the other. The same is not true of Girard. There is a circle of people, it's rather large right now, that knew Rene. Okay, so let's say it's 200 people. Over the next decades, that 200 is going to get whittled down and whittled down and whittled down and whittled down until there are a few people left that knew Girard during his lifetime. That's how you have to imagine this process during the apostolic period. As the church is growing, you're going to have a bigger and bigger ratio of non-eyewitnesses to eyewitnesses. That's number one. But the eyewitnesses are there, and they help what Kenneth Bailey and Jimmy Dunn call informal control of the tradition. That is, it's not simply that somebody gets to make something up and then it gets put into the gospel tradition, as was assumed, for example, for a long time about the passion prophecies of Jesus, that he was going to die, or any of the eschatological prophecies about the temple. It was just assumed simply these were early Christian prophets who created these sayings in the Lord's name, and then they somehow ended up in the tradition and then getting connected to the stuff Jesus actually said and this sort of thing. No, there were formal controls on this kind of thing. And that I'm not saying here is that you're not going to find later things that are important to the early church written into the gospel narrative. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that you're not going to have the kind of free-for-all with the tradition that the early form critics presupposed, and that our modern third questers often suppose as well. So the first thing is, there are these eyewitnesses that bring an informal control on the tradition. Second, according to Riesenfeld and Gerhardsen, and as well Jimmy Dunn in his book, he has this rather fine book for those of you that want on the oral gospel tradition. Okay, this is really, it's a phenomenal piece of work. And it's probably the best piece of work out there right now when it comes to understanding how the oral tradition develops. But Dunn observes in this book that when we look at the development of the oral tradition, we have to also account for the fact that there were those within the early church and even within the early Jesus movement, that is the movement prior to the death of Jesus, his movement, that there would have been scribes. There would have been those that would have taken notes. So it's conceivable that there are, quote, notebooks in early Christendom that get circulated with sayings or teachings of Jesus. So one would not be surprised to find, for example, that there might be a document circulated that has a certain chunk of ethical teaching of Jesus, like the Sermon on the Mount, perhaps, or an early catechesis, perhaps. And it should not then also be surprising that we're going to find similarities in the tradition, and these similarities will also have differences. Take, for example, the Lord's Prayer. In Luke, it's just simply Abba. In Matthew, it's our Father, whereas for Luke, it's just Father. The Lucan version is very short. Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Give us this day our daily bread, forgive us our trespasses, and lead us not into the test. That's Luke, bam. Matthew's Lord's Prayer has been liturgized. That is, it's antiphonic. So it's our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You have these balanced verses. Give us this day our daily bread. And that's why we use Matthew's version in church. It's sonorous. It flows off the tongue. And you could say, well, which one did Jesus say? Did he say the short one or did he say the long one? And you have to say, ultimately, it doesn't really matter. Because in Matthew's longer version, you have an interpretive process going on with this prayer. And you may already have one going on with Luke's prayer. But the fact is, there are certain things that belong in this prayer. The designation of God as Father, the petition for God to rule or reign over Israel and the Gentiles, the petition for God to hallow God's name, to make God's name, Hashem, this distinctive, benevolent deity we've talked about, to make that name distinct amongst all the gods. And that's really what's happening today. If you, for my money, as Christian idolatry is made more and more manifest, I really do think that the Father is magnifying God's own name today in that sense. So you have these different prayers, but it really, if you start going, well, which one did Jesus really say? Because that's the one I want to say. You're being fetishistic. It's just like certain Christians of a very conservative type insist on referring to Jesus as Yeshua, because they think somehow Yeshua is a magical name because that's his real name, as though Jesus isn't sufficient. So they get fetishistic about words, and we ought not to get fetishistic about words when it comes to the gospel tradition, because what we're recognizing is that there is an informal control over the tradition, because there are many eyewitnesses, number one, and second, there are going to have been either oral documents, that is somebody that's collected things together in a memorizable pattern, often a chiastic pattern, or there's going to be other sorts of notebooks like the so-called Q document, or that sort of thing. Third, I want to read you another important element out of this from Michael Bird's book, The Gospel of the Lord, How the Early Church Wrote the Story of Jesus. He observes, we have to take into account that the early church was a fairly small movement, with perhaps no more than 20,000 adherents by 70 CE. And he's got a footnote for that, and that's where I drew that from earlier. And very mobile, as leaders moved around a lot with close interaction and sharing of literature and traditions between various communities. We know this to be the case already from Paul's letters, that James or Peter and his followers, or perhaps other Pharisaic leaders from Jerusalem, are harassing Paul's churches in Corinth and Galatia. There's mobility going on. The book of Acts certainly testifies to that over and over as it speaks of the growth of the church. So travel between eyewitnesses encountering other eyewitnesses, sharing stories, would contribute to this growing body of tradition about Jesus. But why? Why would the church pass that on? Well, one of the important things I mentioned to you about Dunn's book was his emphasis on the impact of Jesus as that which is to be studied. I'm going to read a rather lengthy paragraph here from his book on the oral gospel tradition. The memory, this is Jimmy Dunn, the memory of what Jesus said and did, as formulated in the Jesus tradition, was not regarded as a kind of sacred relic, to be shut up in some reliquary or encased in perspex to be venerated and carried in procession before reverent assemblies. This tradition was their lifeblood, their living breath. It enabled them to re-experience the remembered Jesus, to hear him afresh, and to witness for themselves what he had said and done. It was living because they lived by it. And it enabled them to live lives of discipleship. That is, the story of Jesus is collected precisely because there is a pattern of behavior here. And we've talked about this over and over and over again. There's this didache, there's this ethical substratum that says that the Christian, the follower of Jesus, has these certain characteristics as part of who they are. And these characteristics are very, very anti-world, anti-Jew and religion, anti-Gentile in religion. These characteristics express the character of the one God who comes into a world that only knows sick, violent gods, and thus produces sick, violent cultures. And so it's this ethical substratum. They're living, and now they are remembering Jesus and his life because this discipleship was his life. It worked for him. It was his paradigm. He imitated the Father. We imitate him. And this accounts for the emphasis on discipleship in all four Gospels and the category of mimesis in Paul. But Jimmy Dunn will go on to say, with regard to the Lord's Prayer and the Eucharistic words. Now think about this. He notes, two very important liturgical pieces where words are important: the Lord's Prayer and the Eucharist, the words of the institution. And yet, of the four times we have words of institution, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul, they're different. Of the two times we have the Lord's Prayer, Matthew and Luke, they're different. Does it really matter the exact words? And the answer is no. It's the act itself, it's the prayer itself, and the using of the common structure that becomes everything that one can begin to riff off of. Okay, so Dunn says this: rather than to be regarded as cadavers suitable only for clinical dissection, the differing traditions and the developing traditions, as attested not least in the manuscript tradition of these texts, should have been seen as evidence of traditions much used and much beloved, whose development still bears witness to the symbiotic relation between the living tradition and the living church. In other words, you cannot separate the so-called historical Jesus from the risen Christ in the body of believers. They are all together of a piece. That's why we together are on this journey together. It would be one thing for me to sit in my study and write a book about all of this, and it would not be near as impactful because I'm not necessarily living that ethical substratum out in my life, in my libraries. I just do this thing by myself. But in a community like we are, a little gathered community where we are processing things together, we are learning to live this love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy, forgive those as you want to be forgiven, don't judge, all of that stuff that we've talked about. Is we're learning to live it together. We are also having conversations together about this substratum and what it means and how we live it, but also we're having conversations about the Lord himself who lived it out in his own environment. But we're not doing so slavishly in some kind of word for word imitation. Oh gosh, we have to know the exact words Jesus said so we can say them like their magical formula. No, there is a freedom in the community given in the Spirit to take these memories of Jesus that these eyewitnesses have, to share what they remember, and then for the community to begin to shape that into this story that will ultimately become a text known as the gospel. So this narrative is being shaped this whole time. We want to keep in mind also a couple of other things as the tradition develops from 33 till 70 CE. First, and I've mentioned this before, Geert Tyson in his book, The Gospels in Context, makes an excellent case that the passion narrative, that is the frame of the passion narrative from the arrest in the garden through the burial, that was put together in narrative form in and around the year 41, when James, the son of Zebedee, would have been the first apostle to be killed by the authorities. Now, the reason that I think this comes into being is you have this group of apostles, this 12, and there's every reason to believe they think that Jesus is coming back in their lifetime to bring about the reign of God amongst the people of Israel. There's every reason to believe that. I'm reading a book right now on James, Jesus' brother James, by Sean Frayne. Fantastic little book. But again, just buttresses this argument that early Christendom, this group of 12, as they're going from 33 to 35, Paul gets converted, to 37 to 39. Paul goes out on a missionary journey. 41, bam, there's no Roman procurator, so boom, the Jewish authorities can do all kinds of shenanigans, and they do every time there's a Roman procurator gets called back or dies, and there's months and weeks before a new one comes in. That's when the Jewish authorities come in and start persecuting the Jewish Christians. This is certainly what happened to James in 62. There was a vacancy in Jerusalem of Roman authority, and so Ananus, the Sadducean high priest, has James along with a bunch of others killed. At any rate, the passion narrative, the story of the death of Jesus, gets developed in 41 because now for the first time that these apostles, this apostolic community, is having to confront the fact that they too may die before this return of Jesus. So the passion narrative is formed that, again, is part of this ethical substratum, so that when they die, they will die nonviolently. They will not retaliate. They will, like Stephen, pray for those that persecute them. That's the function of the passion narrative. It grounds the imitation of Christ in a theology of the cross from that point on. And it's after that period that this ethical substratum, this didache, that becomes perhaps the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, the little book, the Didache, and perhaps other collections. It's at this point that this Didache about how we are to behave is tied to the life of the one who lived this before us, so that there's no distinction to be had between the historical Jesus and the risen Christ in the body of believers. One of the latest disciplines that New Testament scholars engage here is called social memory. It's how communities form memories and develop traditions. And one of the things that Dunn and Bird and Kenneth Bailey and others have done in the formation of social memory is to go back and look at how memory was formed in the ancient world. And one of the ways that is done is to assume purely literary relations between things. That is, we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we go, oh gosh, Matthew borrowed from Mark, and Luke borrowed from Matthew, or Matthew and Luke both borrowed from Mark, and the Q document. And we assume everything in terms of literary relations. Okay, this is false. Different communities are going to have the same parables, sets of parables, but some of them are going to be told a little different. So if you take, for example, the parable of the tenants, as it's told in Matthew and then in Mark and Luke, in the parable of the tenants, as it's found in Mark and Luke, Jesus answers his own question as to who is this son that gets killed in the parable of the tenants, that the son is the rock. But in Matthew, Jesus asks that of his interlocutors, and they have to respond. That is, they have to damn themselves. And so you could say, well, we know Mark was the earliest gospel, Matthew borrowed from Mark. And so what we have here is a Matthean redaction. He's edited the story this way and that. And then there's the work, for example, of Klein Snodgrass, who's been able to show that, in fact, Matthew's version of that parable has a better claim to, quote, historicity in terms of the interaction, that is, who's saying what to whom, than the Markan version or Luke's version taken over from Mark. So you can't just assume that because it's in Mark, it's the earliest piece of the tradition. It may well have been that Matthew or Luke is going to preserve a piece of the tradition or a saying that is, in fact, an earlier form of it. And that doesn't discount the fact that it may well be that Jesus said things on certain occasions multiple times, and that he used different versions of it. So, for example, Luke has, blessed are the poor. Matthew has, blessed are the poor in spirit. And you could say, well, they're different. They're not substantively different, because for both, the poor, the hoi tokoi, are economically deprived. But economic deprivation leads to social deprivation, spiritual deprivation, psychological deprivation. Look at the challenge a mother faces when she can't feed her children. That's more than just economic poverty. It's soul poverty at that point. And so blessed are the poor and blessed are the poor in spirit are referring to the same reality. One is not limited to a monetary sphere and the other limited to a spiritual sphere. No, they're all interconnected, as can be seen by the use of the term in the book of Psalms and in the Qumran scrolls. So we don't have to go, oh, which one is original? They both may well have been original to Jesus, said one way at this time and another way at that time. The point here is that the Gospels themselves give us a ton of material, and it claims to be associated with the historical life of Jesus. And it also claims to be interpreted through the living body of the church. And we can't separate that out. And by the way, this also ought to give us a bit of freedom when it comes to texts. I'll just do an aside here before I continue on social memory. Some people say to me they want the best Bible translation because they're wanting to get back to, quote, the original text. And that's why I have Greek students. They want to get back to an original text. And then the first thing they learn is there is no original text. We're reading a critical edition of manuscripts put together by a group of scholars. We're not reading the original text. And so anytime anybody says to you, the original Greek says, you just need to say bullshit. There is no original Greek text. We just have thousands of manuscripts, and a critical edition is what we have. Getting back to some pristine original, that like a seed, and then we can parse it out as we watch it grow and develop, is a fruitless task, my friends. Because Jesus cannot be divorced from the work of the Spirit in the life of the body of believers. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in the New Testament. It doesn't happen in church history. Jesus is always present with his people. Now, does that mean he's in all these churches on Sunday mornings? Absolutely not. Okay. Does that mean he's present in every mass that's celebrated by a Catholic priest? I don't know. But what it does mean is that anytime you have a group of people together making a decision to live together in such a way that they forgive each other's sins, they bear each other's burdens, they support one another, they love one another, and they're willing to do this without legalism, okay, without some kind of authoritarian top-down hierarchy, which so co-opted the Jesus movement. When that happens, then you have a community that in living out this ethical substratum is actually living this life of Jesus by the Spirit. So the world, in seeing them, sees Jesus, and when they see Jesus, they see the Father. That's the whole point of the church. Back to social memory, quoting Bert again. A further qualification should be made, since remembering Jesus never happened in a vacuum, but transpired in a social setting. Memories are not cherished in the vault of one's private mind, but are sorted, shared, and spread throughout a community that equally cherishes the memory of a collective past. The memory of Jesus became, in a sense, and this word is in quotes, intersubjective. Now, for you mimetic theorists out there that recognize that we work with interdivisiduality, that is, that there's no such thing as individuals, that we are interdividual, we are relational. This intersubjectivity category at this particular point should be ringing lots of bells. He carries on. This is for the historian a good thing, since the sharing of a memory with others and subsequent social dialogue can correct imagination and misremembering to a reasonable extent. The memory of Jesus was cultivated in a community context where key individuals and the group consensus determined the veracity and continuity of the memory against prior acts of remembering and its comparison with other memories of Jesus. The sociology of memory is one of the best factors to account for its preservation and integrity. And we are well aware that, in fact, Jesus calls us to remember him. Do this in memory of me. Do this as you remember me. Or even during his lifetime, he seems to have been aware that after his death, stories would be told about him. And so the woman who wipes his feet with her hair, in Luke, Jesus will say, whenever my story is told, this woman will be remembered. And she was. So this remembering of Jesus that occurs in the social context of the Christian community is, as it were, a body that has been, say, amputated into fragments, a head and toes and hands and feet and arms and legs all cut off. And it gets put back together. This tradition, this story gets put back together. And Jesus is remembered. These members are brought back together again. And thus, over this 40-year period, there's going to be a development of his story. Each community is going to take the parts of the story that are important to them. Not all stories are equal in the early church. The early church is seeking to pass on this tradition, but the early communities are going to be remembering the parts of the tradition that are important for them and their social context, which is why Matthew's gospel seems to have an awful lot of rabbinic, halakhic sayings and teachings of Jesus. You have heard it said, but I say to you. Or Jesus making judgments and pronouncements about which particular Pharisaic rules and regulations he's willing to follow and which ones he's not. So that's because Matthew's community is strongly influenced by the right particular ways to walk, to halakha, to conduct one's life as a Jew. What are the things that are acceptable as a Jew who also follows Jesus as Messiah? John's gospel, on the other hand, seems to have a much more ambivalent relationship to Judaism. And it's the followers of the Johannine gospel that seem to be getting disenfranchised from the synagogue. And so it is the Johannine author is going to set up a Jesus-Moses parallelism, because the authority for the Johannine community is Jesus, whereas the authority for the synagogue was Moses. And the Johannine gospel, rather than seeking to ask, how can I, as a good Jew, live this life of Jesus in my context, like is being done in Matthean communities context, for the Johannine communities context, there has been a major split with the synagogue. And now it's a question of where the true authority lies. Is it with Jesus or is it with Moses? Luke's gospel. Luke seems to be bringing together both this Pauline tradition, as we know, and this Petrine James Jerusalem church tradition that we're quite familiar with by now. And we can see this in the book of Acts, but it seems to be also occurring within Luke's gospel. And we see this in the travel log, where from chapter 951 through 1810, that's that section in the middle of Luke where there's no Mark at all, nothing from Mark. Luke stops using the Gospel of Mark right there and will not come back to the Gospel of Mark for another 10 chapters. And in this travel narrative, you have Jesus as a rejected prophet like Moses theme going on. It would appear that Luke is writing to those who are in Judaism. His community is not Jewish, it's very Gentile, but he's writing to those who, to help them understand why it is that there is something occurring here with Jesus in relation to Moses, and it's not a supersessionist type thinking like one might say you find in the Gospel of John, but neither is it more accommodative like you find in Matthew. So each of these writers is writing in a social context and wrestling with Jesus' relationship to Judaism. We see this too in the Gospel of Mark. Already in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, if it's written at 70 CE, we have a text where Jesus is saying, that is, quote, in his lifetime, the so-called historical Jesus is saying, all foods are clean. That is, Jesus nullifies the category of kosher in his lifetime. And kosher was one of the three pillars that marked off Jewish identity in the first century, Sabbath keeping and circumcision being the other two. Is it any wonder that when we get to Antioch in 48, we see Paul using that same argument? Did Jesus, in fact, challenge this concept or category of kosher? I think he did. I think we can also argue that Jesus challenged the category of what constituted holiness as well. But in either case, we are still dealing with communities that are going to remember the particular stories that shape their identity and help them to live in the ancient world. This is especially true of the Gospel of John. And there at the end, the editor very clearly says, you know what? There were lots of stories that could have been written here. Would have taken a room full of books. But these were written that you might believe. That is, the purpose of the gospel narrative is to create trust that this one who lived and walked in Palestine, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, was raised again and ascended into heaven, that this one is the one to follow, that this one is the Son of the living God. And that's what we're looking at when we look at the gospel's memory and tradition in the early church. Yes, do we find conflict in the gospel tradition? Sure we do. Do we find substantive theological differences in the gospels? Yes, we do. But that doesn't vitiate the fact that the life of Jesus, as it's told in all four gospels and in Paul, is identical to that ethical substratum of love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself, forgive one another. Jesus lives this thing out in his life. And then after his resurrection and the sending of the Spirit, he lives this exact same thing out in us. That's what the life of Christ was in the early church. It was not some mystical union or some trying to have an experience of God, you know, like one needs peyote or something for it. It had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with the kind of life that's being lived out in the community, and then the way that life is told in a story. So from my perspective, the Gospels don't need to agree. And they can show us various stages of how the early church was interpreting Jesus in their own communities, and thus give us the freedom today to become a community and do the same thing they did, ask who is Jesus for us today. Whereas we might have to set up Jesus against Nietzsche or Jesus against Heidegger or whatever's the authority within culture, Jesus against evangelicalism. I didn't say that. No, I did. Whatever the authority is, we can do that. And we can tell his story and take the stories that we know from the tradition, which we have 4 of. We can tell his story, and that's why certain texts are always going to inform this community. So the memory of Jesus is given us by the Spirit. And this brings us now to conclude with the Gospel of John, where the writer of the Gospel of John has Jesus talking about the coming Paraclete, the coming advocate. And Jesus says, he will take what is mine and make it yours. He will speak only about me, Jesus says. The Spirit does not speak about 7 heavens. The Spirit does not speak about all kinds of throne rooms and all kinds of other things out there in the Gnostic tradition or the modern charismatic tradition. The Spirit only bears witness to the Son, just as the Son bears witness to the Father. And when that happens, the Trinity is a living hermeneutic that we literally live out, my friends. We become part of that. That's the whole point of the gospel tradition. We are a living hermeneutic. And that's very, very different than having an intellectual hermeneutic or any other kind of hermeneutic. We are a living hermeneutic. And that's why our tradition is alive and why we as a body are alive.